Sup, friends? This is our last week of textbook material. Next week, I'll have some just for whatever the heck I want to. But I'm actually planning, so I'm filming all this before our semester starts. I'm saving that whatever the heck I want to material until later in the semester just to see what happens in the world between now and then. Because you never know. Uh, so, to you, that doesn't seem very far away. To me, that's months away. But anyway, this is our last textbook chapter, monetary policy. So what is monetary policy? Well, it's going to have a very similar feel to fiscal policy in that the goal is to stabilize the economy, which on our graph just means get back to potential output again. Now, the channel of doing that is different. It's no longer through government taxing and spending. Now it's through changing the money supply. And you learned about money multipliers and all of that last week. Well, this week we're learning about money supply, and we're learning about interest rates, and we're learning about all kinds of other stuff. And the general idea is that the Fed, the Federal Reserve, can print a bunch of money, which will be expansionary policy, or they can reduce the money supply, which will be contractionary policy. In this mini lecture, I'm going to give you a brief overview as to how that works, although a lot more details coming in the next few videos. But the gist is this. Banks use reserves to make loans. Those loans are used to make stuff, build a house, build a car, whatever. And so bank lending is generally seen as something that is expansionary. It leads to more building and more production. So if the Fed can make banks lend more, that's expansionary policy. If the Feds can reduce bank lending, that's contractionary policy. And it turns out the Fed can manipulate bank lending, usually. There are some limitations, but it goes like this. Banks have their balance sheets, which have assets and liabilities on them. Among those assets are reserves and securities. So what are securities? That is a bank. So banks are regulated on what kinds of stuff they're allowed. They're not allowed to buy a bunch of Bitcoin, for instance, but they can buy government bonds, government debt, so that they can have some source of income that is safe and reliable, but gives them a few percent a year. So they like to have at least some of their stuff be tied up in those. So the Fed can manipulate bank lending by buying and selling these securities from the banks. How does that work? Well, if the Fed says, hey, bank, I'm going to buy your treasury bonds, your T-bills, what happens? The bank sells them, which means that the bank loses some bonds but gains some cash or electronic cash, but it goes in their bank reserves. So when the Fed buys bonds from banks, it increases bank reserves because they're selling their stuff and getting reserves in return. So when the Fed buys bonds from banks, that gives banks reserves they need to make loans, which are expansionary policy. That is an indirect effect, but it shows how buying bonds is expansionary policy. And that increases the money supply. Also, increasing the money supply is the expansionary policy, blah, blah, blah. Likewise, if the Fed sells treasury bills to the banks pick up this new T-bill, but they're paying out of their reserves to the Fed, which reduces reserves and reduces lending, decreasing the money supply and is contractionary policy. Cool. Now, there's a whole chat in here about the money market and how that affects interest rates and how those interest rates affect consumption and investment. That's all coming. Technical videos go into that pretty good. But in general, overview, when they buy a bunch of bonds and inject a bunch of money into the economy, interest rates go down because money is less valuable because there's so much more of it. And when they sell bonds and reduce the money supply, interest rates go up. Now, over the last several years, the Federal Reserve has kept interest rates pretty low. There was, if we look at the last 20 years here, leading into the housing bubble and the Great Recession, the Fed saw that the economy was getting too heated, and so they started selling bonds and raising the interest rate, hoping to slow the economy down. Then a recession hit, and so they started pushing interest rates back down. That was not an organic rise and fall of interest rates. That was Fed policy both ways. And they kept interest rates down for years as we slowly recovered from the Great Recession. And then in 2016 started taking interest rates back up and up and up. And then COVID, they dropped it back down. Okay, selling or at least slowing down their purchases. Letting interest rates go up was contractionary policy, which is what you do during really good times. And then COVID was bad times, so they dropped the interest rates back down. And they kept it down for a while. And oh man, they're raising interest rates again. And if you look at that, that's actually faster than either of these other rises. Why is that? Well, contractionary policy is something you do to avoid inflation. And there was enough inflation going on that the Fed is now in high gear fighting it. And as of the time I'm filming this, the last several months, each time the Fed has met, they've announced very large increases in their target interest rate, their federal funds rate. The hope being they can raise interest rates for the banks, which will raise interest rates through the economy and have contractionary side effects that slow the economy down and get inflation under control. Now, if you want a little bit of a longer view of this, these are those little bumps I was just showing you. The interest rates have been much higher in the past. This time in the early 80s, we'll talk about that in one of my videos. There's the one about stagflation in the Fed. A lot of details there. But inflation was really high, so they pushed interest rates up really high to kill the inflation. But there's a lot more detail on that there. Something interesting that I think is going on is right now it seems that there is a disconnect between what our federal government is doing with fiscal policy versus what the Federal Reserve is doing with monetary policy. For instance, there was just this Inflation Reduction Act that was passed through Congress or whatever. I'll be curious to see where all that leads. But I noticed that a lot of the stuff people were saying about it was there was like billions of dollars laid aside for spending on clean energy and stuff. That's an expansionary policy. Like, yeah, we're worried about gas prices. That's fine. I don't want to like comment specifically on like the actual provisions, but when they outline hundreds of billions of dollars of spending, that's expansionary policy. And a policy like that will actually contribute to further inflation, at least on that dimension. There were other provisions too, some of which actually do fight the inflation. So it's interesting to see the seeing the federal government doing some inflationary policies, while the Federal Reserve is fighting inflation as hard as they can, raising interest rates. But they don't want to just like nuke it, right? They're not just going to like jump it to 5%, because there is a big problem here, which is they can totally start a recession. Let me show you a cool graph. All right, so check this graph out. Let's go back to that like late 70s, early 80s bit where we had all that inflation. It was actually stagflation. There was also high unemployment, which really sucked. So check this out. The unemployment rate was about 8%, while inflation was 14%. Okay. Right now, the unemployment rate is still very low at 3.5%, which is a historical low. Okay. Bigger numbers over here. And our inflation rate is like 8 or 9% a year. Theirs was like 14. Okay. Their supply shock was much worse than our COVID one. Okay. Anyway, so here we were. Let's look at this point here. 8% unemployment and this. And what did the Fed do? More details to come, but they raised the interest rate a lot to fight the inflation. And you see the inflation go and plummet down to 2%. What happened? Unemployment went up to nearly 12. And so that's the thought I want to leave you with this. We know from our aggregate supply, aggregate demand graph that when you're dealing with contractionary or expansionary policy, anything that increases GDP probably increases inflation, which means that anything that decreases unemployment probably raises inflation. So our two goals are kind of opposed to each other there. Anything that fights inflation will probably raise unemployment. And so the Fed is gradually raising this because they don't want to overdo it. They would rather ease into it and fight the inflation, but not cause a massive recession if they can avoid it. Now, at the time I'm filming this, the economy still has 3-point-something% unemployment. The economy is still doing great. It just has a lot of inflation. I'm curious where it will be at the end of the semester. But by then, we'll probably have something to say. And so I'll see you next week for an update. All right, guys. I hope this is helpful. Do check out the technical videos. I go into some of this stuff, especially the stagflation stuff. Helps you think about what they're doing. And it might help you learn some lessons about what's going on right now. So have some fun, learn some stuff. We're almost there, friends. We're almost there.